Hello, I'm Ross Edwards. I'm a composer. Having recently turned 81, I thought it might be a useful thing for me to actually reflect on the music scene as it was leading up to the formation of the AMC. When I was growing up in Sydney, I was aware of composers like John Antill and Margaret Sutherland, and I would hear them every so often on the radio. But for me, the 1950s and 60s were musically very bleak. There'd been no music at my school, and I knew no one who shared my passionate interest for music. From the age of 13, I was determined to become a composer. Although I learnt piano, there was no one who could teach me composition. So I had to teach myself. Any concept of there being such a thing as Australian music just wasn't taken seriously. In my late teens, I became a student at the music department of Sydney University, and I remember the day when our professor, Donald Peart, walked into the lecture room in a state of great excitement, and he wrote some names on the whiteboard, including those of Richard Meal, Peter Sculthorpe, and Larry Sitzky. These composers, he said, will determine the future of music in Australia. He'd just attended a conference in Hobart, which had raised the idea of an Australian music by Australians for Australians. The Hobart Conference, which was repeated a few years later, generated an air of excitement. Composers like Don Banks and Malcolm Williamson had felt the need to pursue their careers overseas. Don Banks returned to head the School of Composition at Sydney Conservatorium, and Peter Sculthorpe, after studying at Oxford University, was appointed lecturer at Sydney University. Professor John Bishop, and his successor David Gulliver, turned Adelaide's Elder Conservatorium, where I was a student later, into a mecca for young composers, importing such luminaries as Peter Maxwell Davies and the Hungarian Sándor Veres, both of whom became my teachers. Meanwhile, James Murdoch, a young Australian musician, had returned from Spain, where he'd been working as pianist for a ballet company. He'd had the misfortune of permanently injuring one of his hands, and so he was unable to continue his career as a professional pianist. Settling in Melbourne, he transferred his passion and energy into promoting Australian composers. And to this end, he became secretary of the Melbourne branch of the International Society for Contemporary Music. This would eventually lead to the formation by Vincent Plush of the Seymour Group Ensemble, dedicated to the commissioning and performance of new Australian music. And by 1970, the notion of an Australian music had become well and truly a reality accepted by society. Well, a small sector of it anyway. James Murdoch's charm, sophistication, and fearless championing of Australian music created quite a stir in contemporary music circles. I was one of the young composers he periodically summoned to Melbourne to be groomed and introduced to people James considered to be strategically important. For James, the ideal composer was a highly presentable individual, adept at wheeling and dealing, and if talent sometimes appeared a lesser prerequisite, he probably would have argued that without an effective platform, it was useless anyway. Beneath his extravagant personality, James was a realist. He deplored the conventional image of a scruffy, head-in-the-clouds composer, and was at pains, both to remodel it both sartorially and, I suppose, psychologically. He didn't have much luck with me, unfortunately, and his whimsical observations and deft sarcasms have stayed with me ever since. He could be waspish, but at heart he came across as a sensitive, caring person who understood the essential needs of musicians. Among the many examples of his kindness and concern is the way that he looked after composers like Margaret Sutherland and Peggy Glanville Hicks through their years of failing health. He tirelessly promoted Australian music, and he would use all of his personal charm to buttonhole business leaders and beguile festival directors. When the Australia Council provided funds for a music centre, James was appointed inaugural director. In 1975, the AMC moved into the premises that it occupied for some years at 80 George Street in the historic Rocks area of Sydney. The new AMC soon had a library, information centre, a newsletter, and provision for the copying of parts, which in those days were all done by hand. The building was an ideal venue for staging concerts, which happened regularly, and it also functioned as a meeting place for discussing and for social interaction. And there was quiet places where people could just study scores and quietly. Young musicians revelled in the congenial atmosphere of friendship, in which we felt usefully creative and on the brink of something wonderful. Throughout its various forms and transformations, I've always found the AMC most helpful, as have so many of my colleagues, as well as students and music lovers. I mean, the fact that there's this oasis of sanity in the music centre is very important indeed. And without it, without it, where would we be?